Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Business Continuity Planning and Basics event today. My name is James Tantram, where I'm the Director of Product Management here at Rogers Data Centers. Our mission is to help Canadian organizations truly realize their digital transformation potential through the adoption of multi-cloud technologies. We help businesses, in fact, optimize and load their workloads in the right cloud, whether that be on-prem, in a co-location facility, in one of our hosted cloud environments, or in fact the public cloud, really in order to minimize costs, maximize control, be scalable, and always be secure. I'm very fortunate today. I'm joined by a really distinguished colleague of mine, Craig McLellan, who is the Chief Executive Officer at ThinkOn Inc. Craig, and I think it goes without saying, is very much an innovator and thought leader when it comes to business continuity, disaster recovery, and data protection. He's really been at the forefront of technology innovation and data security in Canada for over 25 years. Presently, Craig runs ThinkOn. This is an organization that has grown organically and through strategic acquisition, and is actually 19th on the Profit 500 list of fastest growing companies in Canada. Craig's leadership and insights really presents him several opportunities. He sits on the board of several leading technology companies, including Veeam, Hitachi, and VMware, where he really provides market insight and helps guide strategy for those businesses when it comes to technology and innovation. Today is, in fact, the first of four events that we're coordinating that really look at how Canada is adapting to the pandemic when it comes to data protection, business continuity planning, and cloud adoption. So without further ado, we'll jump into today's session. Really, the point and objectives today are to help businesses really understand what a business continuity plan is all about, why it's important to businesses, particularly in light of what we've experienced over the last 6 months or so. What are some of the best practices that we can incorporate into our business continuity plans and strategies, how to evaluate, how to formulate a business continuity plan. And then as we really get into disaster recovery, what are the best practices to actually implement, adopt, and actually execute on a business continuity plan. So what is a business continuity plan is probably the best place to start. And really, business continuity plan is really about an organization planning for events that create failure or prevent access to infrastructure. But actually, BCP is a lot more than that. It really deals with evaluating all of the risks that potentially impact a business when it comes to an organization's ability to execute from a people and skills perspective, certainly from a process standpoint, but also from a systems perspective. And a BCP really looks at holistically, what is critical to a business in terms of its functions, how it serves customers and stakeholders, identifies, what the impact is to really a loss of a business function, and then ultimately seeks to ensure that a business is able to sustain and maintain operations through whatever event or issue that disrupts that specific process. There really are a number of scenarios that organizations need to account for and take into consideration when they're planning and looking at their business continuity plans. And historically, there were really two key elements or variables that businesses prepared for and evaluated when it came down to readiness. The first was the loss of a specific office site. And so, in consideration of a BCP plan when it comes to an actual site or office, the thinking there was that, hey, staff would be unable to access a site due to perhaps a flood or perhaps some event that has limited access to that location. And so the planning around a specific site was perhaps to send staff to an alternative location, an alternative office, perhaps have those staff work from home for a number of days until that office sort of became available and staff could be sent to that office. The other most common scenario that organizations prepared for was really an IT outage event where failure of a data center, of infrastructure, or perhaps of an application, brought an IT system down. And so organizations were really prepared in terms of understanding how to recover that workload and recover that application and minimize ultimately the impact to customers and stakeholders. What's happened, of course, in the market over the last 6 months or so is that these business continuity plans, the unavailable office and the IT outage, really did not prepare most Canadian organizations for what we actually saw, which was a national emergency. And over the last 6 months, we faced scenarios, and to this day face a situation where for many businesses, their office locations are in fact closed to all staff, but perhaps the most essential staff. We were at points, over the last 6 months where we were potentially facing restrictions in employee mobility and movement as we looked at, the possibility of actually having shelter-in-place orders being mandated. And so organizations had to adapt really in an instant to this reality. And I think back in March, we've seen statistics that actually indicated about 4.7 million Canadians transitioned from working in a traditional office environment to working at home. And so that begs the question, really, how are Canadian businesses continuing to maintain and operate, core business functions and systems? What are the ways that they've really accommodated and augmented their existing business continuity plans to stay up and running? And Craig, I'm really going to look to yourself as an expert in this domain. Prior to ThinkOn, you led in Canada the managed services practice and business continuity practice at SunGard. So I think you've had some experience, obviously, in terms of helping businesses plan and prioritize how to sustain and manage operations through these types of events. So I think it would be really helpful if you can, sort of share what have been some of your observations over the last 6 months. How are businesses reacting? And then perhaps let's go back to first principles and really look at, if a business is starting from scratch or reevaluating their BCP plans, what are some of the best practices that a business should be looking to incorporate as they evaluate and sort of rebuild their readiness and preparedness for the next emergency, if you will?
Great. Thank you, James. So it's a pleasure to be here today. And as always, sometimes I can still find excitement talking about disaster recovery and business continuity after all these years. So I think you hit the nail on the head. There's been quite a change over the last 6 months. Many plans, I think, were rendered somewhat obsolete through that process of just the new norm. And I was thinking about my own business. We sent 58 employees home in one day in March, and we suddenly introduced 58 new attack surfaces for the malfeasance that goes on out there. And a lot of times people don't consider what's happening in the area of malware and ransomware to be another form of disaster. So just as one small comment I would make, and that is that you need to consider those sorts of events to be disasters. I continue to hear every day about some new organization that's suffered a ransomware attack, and my heart goes out to every one of them. But it's amazing to me how simple the planning can be to avoid it in the first place, just by thinking beyond traditional disaster recovery mechanisms. So to your point, let's just go back in time a little bit and talk about some basics. So I think it's always prudent to just remind people of some terminology because it's used a lot in the industry today. I have a bit of a twist on this, recovery point objective and recovery time objective. I like to think of recovery point objective as really referring to how much data are you prepared to lose. In the case of ransomware, you can lose everything forever. So that's a pretty meager position to be in. But at the same time, if you're not doing simple backups, you're really creating a scenario where you could be giving up a day's or 2 days worth of data, yet more and more organizations run their business on a very small set of applications, whether they be on-prem, in a colo facility, or in the cloud. None of those three service delivery scenarios allow you to abdicate responsibility for knowing what your recovery point objective is and making sure you can actually achieve it. In fact, I would encourage anyone listening today to make sure they hold their service provider accountable if they've outsourced something or put something on a cloud infrastructure, because nothing really changes. You still are the responsible party. From a recovery time objective, this is really about how long someone can operate without the application. And I've sat through a lot of business impact analysis work over the years and heard people talk philosophically about 65 and 70 applications, when the reality is there's 3 or 4 that run the business. So I like to be pretty practical here and remind people that the recovery time objective is really about what it takes to get the business up and functioning. I like to say the applications that keep you in business and keep you out of jail are the applications that really matter. And you have to have a very aggressive timeline when it comes to recovery time objective anymore, because of the speed at which business is conducted.
Craig, I hope you don't mind me asking, but you spoke to the concept of shared responsibility. And this is something that I consistently hear from Canadian businesses that are making that journey to the cloud. And there is often an assumption that by being in the cloud, that the traditional sort of needs and diligence around backup and disaster recovery are no longer needed in the cloud, because that is the responsibility of the cloud service provider. Can you sort of elaborate on what that shared responsibility model means and why that is such a common misconception about the cloud?
Yeah, it's a great question, and certainly is worthy of some more follow-up on that one. So the vast majority of cloud service contracts clearly state that you, the customer, are responsible for your data. As crazy as that may sound, so it's sitting on someone else's infrastructure, being cared and fed for by someone else. That is not about the data. That is about the application infrastructure. And there is a long list of people who inadvertently lost data. As a perfectly simple example, someone performing snapshots on a hypercloud is not a viable alternative to backups. Snapshots age out. They typically go to a very short period of time. Great for a quick recovery, not great for a keep the business doors open scenario. So, James, to really cut to the chase with your question, you can't wash your hands of making sure your data is safe. You have to at least be very clear contractually who is doing it. And I like to say, prove it. If some service provider is saying, yeah, we got that, then no better opportunity than to say, prove it. And what you'll find very quickly is that, oh, it actually is still your responsibility.
That's great, Craig. I think the learnings here are somewhat timeless, and the need to protect the integrity of data is always paramount. So let's get into some of those best practices.
Yeah, so I think there's 3 here that we should talk about today. The reality is, if we had time, there's probably 10 or 15. But the first thing that I like to remind people of is that in the past, you could design for continuous availability out of the box, and you could pull that off because the application or the infrastructure was very monolithic. But things are complex. So you want to achieve continuous availability because, frankly, that is the only way to ensure transactional integrity, and it allows you to avoid disruptions. But you have to design for failure in order to achieve that. You can't live on a wing and a prayer that the infrastructure I put up is going to actually sustain that. You need to make sure that the infrastructure and the application has been designed to suffer a failure and not disrupt availability. So that's one key thing. And it may sound simple in words, but you would be surprised how many application architects and infrastructure operations people like to think that they can design an infallible system when all the best systems are designed for redundancy. The second is workload mobility. It's not good enough to say I've got a backup and I can restore it. I now need to be able to relocate it and move it as quickly as possible, somewhat like an evacuation process. So you need to be able to make sure that your applications have as few permanent hooks, if you will, or proprietary hooks into other infrastructure components so that you can actually move workload. This is not a trivial snap the fingers and I'm going to move an application if it's one of 5, but it really helps people think about the design aspects of this by thinking, well, am I actually using a proprietary API? Am I using a RESTful API? But at the end of the day, this is all about separating applications so that you can move them and put them into the best infrastructure which ultimately then feeds into the last point here about multi-cloud agility. There will be opportunities for co-location. There'll be opportunities for private clouds, and there'll be opportunities for public clouds, but you need to be able to move applications and their underlying data sets between these as best possible. And migration is never trivial. The consultants that tell you it is have never done it before, or just are doing a classic bait and switch. But if you've taken the time to ensure your applications are designed for failure to achieve availability, and that the applications are put together in such a way that you can break them apart and move them, then you can actually achieve multi-cloud agility, because I can move workload between different options. As the workload needs change, or frankly, as my cash supply changes, I can move workloads to where it makes the most sense for the business. So those are three key business continuity practices that I think are really important, that are oftentimes overlooked. So really three things that people need to keep in mind here. First and foremost is scope. This is one of those situations where you can literally run on forever. I mentioned earlier I've been involved in business impact analysis assessments where involved over 70 applications. Those are wonderful make work projects, but they are not keep the business going projects. So you have to be ruthless with your scope. And as I said earlier, it's really about the applications that keep you in business, and that's really about keeping your customers happy and your suppliers paid. And then it's about keeping you out of jail, which I know is, my tongue is firmly in my cheek, but you don't give up compliance just by virtue of encountering a disaster. No auditor or compliance officer or regulatory agency will forgive you just because you've gone through a terrible business situation. And then from a recovery strategy and recovery process perspective, we'll get into these in more detail, but a strategy is really what it takes to get things started, and then the process is all about getting things done. Let's just go forward and talk about so before going further, let's talk about some more detail on scope. So there's some questions you really need to ask yourself and ask others. A key aspect of business continuity planning is this is not something you should do alone. This is something you should do with your coworkers and any sort of stakeholder that's in the business, or a third-party provider that's key to the value chain that you've created. You need to understand how much does an hour of downtime cost? And I realize that can, that's a very difficult question for many people to answer, but it's important, especially now. It's very important to understand what it costs to actually be offline for an hour, because that's how you make a business decision. And how much, then it's easy to extrapolate per day. If you're a 724 shop or a 5x9 shop, it's a different price. But now you know what you're working with and what you really need to have risk against. How long can you be without that system before you start to see revenue loss? And revenue loss is a tricky thing, because some customers leave today and come back tomorrow. Some customers leave today and don't come back. And I can't tell you what kind of customer you have, but depending on what the nature of your customer is, this answer is very different. Because if the next order is the last order, then you need to be up and running much more quickly than if you have a long-term contractual relationship and a customer understands that you've experienced a problem. In fact, customers will normally be very empathetic as long as it's not something that's self-induced. How long does it take to recover the system? That's a funny question too, because people in the systems community take this for granted. But in the days of COVID, imagine if you were suddenly without 50% of your staff because they've gone into quarantine, or their family's in quarantine, or worse. And you don't always have the most experienced and the most gifted people available to execute these sorts of recoveries. So you need to really think through this. Another great reason why continuous availability is important. And then the question about data breach. It's a funny thing. No one likes to talk about data breach, obviously for very good reasons. But when you've had a breach, it actually is another form of a systems failure, because your security's failed. And then suddenly everyone gets very busy trying to figure out what's happened, and the business will suffer from that. So you have to know whether that's ever happened before, and you need to learn from it. You can't ignore it. A security failure is just another form of a business failure. And from a technology perspective, it can be incredibly disruptive. And then the last point here from a scoping perspective is, do I have a monolithic application that it will take me 2 weeks to move it? Or can I move it in a day? It might take you a year to evolve an application to the point where it can be migrated in a day, or you might need to invest in a few tools. It exists. The answers are out there, but you can't continue to kick the can down the road knowing full well that a critical application would take you 2 weeks to rebuild. That's just not a good practice.
Craig, I think we were talking a few days ago, and you mentioned it at the kickoff here, that really back in March, take any size company of N employees, and when those employees were sent home, that attack surface increased by a factor of N. And so the notion of trying to secure data assets behind the corporate firewall sort of vanished overnight. And the data breach, the malware, the ransomware, I think everyone's got a friend that has been impacted. But for everyone else, it's a bit of a, it's something that you can't ignore. It's out there. And just how prevalent is this threat?
Well, I think the threat is a lot more prevalent than any of us want to say, but I'll tell you that it's everywhere. Because it's human nature. You send 58 people home, someone is going to read an email that looks so compelling and so real, and it's not going through the same systems, and the link they click on, results in a catastrophe. So those are very real. But I would tell you that the flip side of this is there are some very simple things that people can be doing that will dramatically reduce the risk. You're going to hear this term more and more, air gap. Put an air gap between a copy of your backup and the digital systems that access it. As soon as you remove, for instance, the ability for a hacker to programmatically access a copy of a backup, you've now just made yourself a much safer place, because that means that only you have access to the data. It might be somewhat inconvenient to get it, but it's a heck of a lot more convenient than having it wiped out or encrypted programmatically just because it was accessible. And that's called air gapping. And it's something that I think your team at Rogers can certainly talk more about.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. So what's a recovery strategy? I would say there's 5 key tenets to consider here, but they all have a little different role to play. First of all, strategy starts with a living, breathing document. I cannot tell you how frustrating it is when someone has to blow the dust off of a recovery strategy document because the business is not evolving at the rate of dust collection. It's evolving much more quickly, but it does require you to actually write stuff down. But it spells out how you're going to overcome an operational challenge. And by the way, as the types and frequencies of challenges changes, so does the recovery strategy. It's not good enough to say I'm still dealing with a smoking hole. I now need to deal with 58 employees going home. You need to know really what you're dealing with in a recovery time objective. Both how much data can I lose, how long can I be without the application. You just have to know. If you don't know that at the strategy level, then you cannot execute on this. And that ties into what the IT organization can really deliver. As I said earlier, monolithic applications, legacy infrastructure, it's a very different challenge. And there are some organizations out there today still running applications on infrastructure that you couldn't buy for the last 5 years because they've been either afraid or challenged or frankly taxed for time on completing the migration. But IT has to be involved in this conversation. And as I said earlier, most organizations, if you presented the option to the business, would tell you they really can't tolerate downtime for a subset of those applications, and that's where you need to spend your money. And the last point is, don't call your friends and ask for a copy of their strategy because it won't work for you. Every strategy is a little different, and it really is critical that those be considered. So, James, why don't I pass this back to you, and you can talk about some different recovery process opportunities that people may be able to participate in.
Sure, thanks, Craig. And I think, obviously when we look at those best practices, understanding the risks evaluating the attack surface and how to mitigate those risks, understanding the costs of downtime, and then ultimately formulating the plan. That is the basics. Ultimately, what is important though is the recovery. And when we talk about backup, when we talk about BCP, really the moment of truth is how effectively that planning is able to be executed in light or in the event of some type of failure or data loss. And so it does come down to adherence to that recovery process. And so once that kind of critical planning and development has been put in place, should actually be straightforward. And I think to Craig's point that ensuring that staff knows where that recovery plan is, that it hasn't been collecting dust, that it's been consistently updated with the right contact information, the right revisioning information, and so forth is key. But effectively, when it comes down to the recovery process, it really starts with evaluating, well, what's actually happened? What workloads have been impacted? For those workloads that are down or are degraded, what is the reason for that outage? Is it infrastructure failure at a server or at a storage level? Is it a network failure? Is it in fact a data center failure? And so really by understanding the root cause and why the outage has occurred is the first step to actually executing on the runbook, because until we know what's happened and what's broken, we don't know what to necessarily go and fix. And of course, time is of the essence. And so there's no shortcut here. Understanding root cause is the first critical step. Once we've got the fault isolated, then it really is a matter of executing on the actual recovery runbook or plan. And so this is the predefined set of processes and actions that a defined individual or function is now going to go and essentially execute in order to bring that workload or that data back online. And of course, this will depend based on, one, the nature of the outage, but more importantly, the data recovery process really depends on the underlying workload and the criticality of that workload. And so for those mission critical workloads, this is essentially going to be, in many cases, an automated essentially failover where the system and the technologies are able to isolate what's failed and exactly why it's failed, and then take the appropriate sort of automated actions to bring that workload back up on and online. For less critical applications, this may in fact be a very manual process where there's a recovery of data from a tape library or from a cloud backup repository, and that data needs to be in fact loaded onto a new infrastructure that's being built. And so this really goes back to that set of planning and understanding what the recovery point objectives and the recovery time objectives are, and ensuring that, particularly from that recovery time objective, meaning how quickly does this application need to be up and running, that the data recovery process is aligned with those expectations. And then finally, data preparation is really about, once the workload is restored, really determining that that recovery was successful. And so our job is not done until we've really validated that the workload is back to its normal operating state, meaning that application is now delivering on its expected SLAs in terms of its ability to transact or serve customers. And it's really only once we've validated that the application is back up and running that we should consider our recovery process complete. So straightforward. Success here is really dependent on having that mature level of planning and a well-defined and documented process. So when it comes to actually meeting on those recovery point objectives and recovery time objectives, there are in fact many technology choices available to businesses in order to really optimize their BCP plan. And when Craig spoke about some of the best practices, he really mentioned that the world now is multi-cloud, and as a result of the world being multi-cloud, there are in fact many different options that allow businesses to really optimize their BCP plan in order to meet those RPOs and RTOs, but in meeting them really achieve the right balance of control and flexibility and cost optimization. And so what we're going to spend the last few minutes of today's session on is really to go through, what are some of the technology platforms that are available that really help to develop and formalize that robust BCP plan when it comes to a sort of technology platform. And so remarkably, and Craig, you spoke about this as well, is that sometimes the best way to really manage and execute a BCP is to ensure that infrastructure is robust, resilient, and diverse. And so co-location is really part of that strategy, where sometimes just protecting an application and ensuring that, or part of that business continuity plan, is in fact just trying to mitigate failure to begin with. And so co-location is, still a great avenue and mechanism to achieve this, because when we think of co-location and the data center in which co-location services are delivered from, that data center is intrinsically designed to deliver on 100% availability, meaning every element of the power systems, the generators, the UPSs, and so forth are actually engineered to be resilient and robust. And so failure of any one of those systems is actually protected by a secondary or diverse system that could ensure that that data center remains up and running. The other key benefit or consideration with co-location is that typically co-location facilities are carrier neutral, meaning there are multiple network service providers that are present in that co-location facility. And that in itself is another way to increase their resiliency and the diversity of the IT solution or infrastructure. That failure of one network provider means that the application is not down. You can take advantage of those other service providers that are typically present in a co-location facility. And so a couple of things to sort of ask yourself when considering co-location and is that the right approach? Does it fit into your BCP plan? I think one, looking at your present on-premise environment, many organizations don't have the capital budgets to really develop and build their own data centers that are built to sort of the standards and resiliency of a co-location facility. And so, that redundancy in the power systems and the UPSs and network and so forth are traditionally very costly, very difficult to replicate in an on-prem environment. And so co-location is a way to provide and really improve the resiliency of a current IT application just by relocating into a data center facility. One of the things that we're really hearing presently, and in light of COVID, is doesn't co-location require me to dispatch technicians to a data center to perform routine tasks such as tape rotations or installation of servers and upgrades or replacement of hard drives? And the answer today is no. Modern data center operators provide services known as smart hands and eyes, where routine tasks such as tape rotations and so forth can be provided by on-site technicians that the co-location provider has on-site, really mitigating the need to dispatch those really critical IT staff into the data center environment, and therefore mitigating some of the the health and safety risks and concerns associated with just travel today and going into another environment. The next technology and service that has really revolutionized BCP is of course the cloud. And when I speak to the cloud here, I'm really talking about the ability to virtualize and run workloads in multi-tenant and single-tenant environments that are managed and operated by a hosting or a cloud provider. And again, one of the key benefits of cloud is that it typically is engineered to deliver on extremely high availability SLAs. And again, the resiliency of that cloud solution typically begins with the engineering of the underlying data center, meaning the actual location where that cloud is hosted is designed to provide 100% uptime. And so by virtue of that, that helps ensure that the cloud environment, is up and running and is less prone to failure. And then even within that cloud environment, it is engineered for resiliency and diversity, meaning no single point of contact in that cloud environment. And if there is a failure, there are other nodes and clusters that can ensure that the disruption to the workload is in fact minimized. The other thing that cloud has really, I think, shone and delivered through the pandemic is its ability to very rapidly scale. And when we think about, what's happened over the last few months, many businesses have increasingly moved towards digital transactions and digital experiences. And so there's been tremendous growth in the demand for server and application capacity. And of course, one of cloud's key value propositions is that it allows an application to scale out almost instantaneously. And so something that is often overlooked in a BCP plan is that a business continuity plan can be about addressing a surge in demand, meaning if demands for products and services grow or grow exponentially, how does an organization respond and ensure that customer experience and SLAs are met? And so incorporating cloud from a scalability standpoint into the BCP really makes a ton of sense to accommodate these kinds of scenarios. The other thing that cloud certainly has solved for is it mitigates a lot of the risks associated with dispatching technicians to on-prem facilities and to data centers. Everything in cloud can obviously be managed and orchestrated remotely. And so with everyone really having a desire to work from home and not have to be dispatched to a business location, cloud is really a great way to help ensure that those critical IT staff are really mitigated and protected from health risks. And so cloud's been a huge factor in helping businesses achieve some of their health and safety policies. Cloud backup is really, I would say, the specific application of cloud to backup in the context of providing a cloud-based data store. And one of the key best practices around just data backup is, what we refer to as 3-2-1 rule, which is data is not truly considered backup. And Craig, again, you mentioned this, that simply performing a snapshot, if you will, in the cloud, that's not a backup. It's a point in time sort of image of an application or workload that it'll age and it'll expire. And so the 3-2-1 rule really states that, hey, you've got to have at least 3 copies of data to ensure that that you've got that resiliency and robustness in your your backups of data. The 2 is essentially that you're using at least 2 discrete medium, meaning you can't have those 3 copies of data sitting on the same hard drive or sitting on the same tape. There's got to be some distribution or air gap, if you will, between those copies, and different media support that. And then the 1 rule is really that at least one of those data copies is stored offsite, meaning if there was a critical failure of a specific site or location, that you've got a copy of that data stored somewhere else. It can be recoverable. And so cloud backup really helps organizations accelerate adherence to 3-2-1 because it provides essentially a +1 to each of those. It allows you to go from 2 copies to 3 very quickly. It allows you to get from 1 medium to 2 medium very quickly. And certainly it being cloud in itself is offsite and discrete from where the data originates. And so cloud has allowed organizations, and cloud backup specifically, has allowed customers and organizations to really mature their set of backup policies very quickly and very cost effectively. So a couple things to consider when it comes to cloud backup. I think first and foremost, are you compliant on that 3-2-1 rule? Are you meeting all of those attributes? And if you're not, cloud backup's a great way to get there. I think in terms of current state, particularly with many IT staff and administration staff not in the office. How effectively and how regularly are traditional tape rotations occurring? And so is data still being backed up? And of course, moving to cloud and cloud backup really eliminates the need for a lot of those manual processes around tape dispatch and tape rotation and so forth. And then, how quickly can data be recovered if data is lost? And one of the core benefits of cloud backup is that data can be validated and can be recovered virtually instantaneously. And so that's a huge step forward, if you will, from traditional tape media, where recovering tape, even identifying which tape holds data, that can be a process that spans several business days. Cloud allows that to, sort of that order of executions, finding the right data set, validating the data set, and recovering the data set allows that to be done in a matter of seconds. And then finally, disaster recovery as a service, which is really the marriage of all of the above, if you will. Disaster recovery as a service brings the resiliency of a 100% uptime data center with the elasticity and scalability of the cloud, along with the kind of offsite nature of cloud backup, brings those together in order to provide essentially a turnkey disaster recovery capability that allows businesses to really, in a matter of seconds in many cases, fully automate the recovery of workloads in the event of a failure at a primary site. And this really allows RPOs and RTOs to be essentially drastically reduced in a way that truly realizes the economies of the cloud, meaning we can get RPOs and RTOs down to minutes with very, very moderate costs, if you will, by really harnessing the elasticity of the cloud. And so a couple of key things to consider today is just, in terms of RPO and RTO objectives, how real are they? How are you actually able to execute and deliver on your defined RPOs and RTOs? A cloud-based disaster recovery as a service really will allow you to accelerate and get to those extremely sort of tight and lower SLAs, if you will. The other is just when previously evaluating disaster recovery as a service was sort of the economics of it prohibitive, meaning disaster recovery solutions typically required an entire secondary stack to be deployed. And so, what that means is essentially to deliver on that replication and disaster recovery type solution, the cost of the IT environment was essentially doubled because you had to double up on the data center, double up on the compute infrastructure, and so forth. Leveraging the cloud has really changed the economics, where that secondary site can be brought up on demand instantaneously, meaning the economics of a cloud-based disaster recovery service are much improved over solutions that were commonplace just a few years ago. And so that's another thing to sort of evaluate and consider when looking at a cloud-based disaster recovery plan. So finally, really tying this back to Rogers, and as I kicked off, Rogers really is your partner in terms of accelerating your digital transformation and the digital transformation of Canada. And a couple of sort of key offers, if you will, really designed to help Canadian businesses adapt and thrive through the pandemic. And essentially the opportunity to trial and test drive our virtual private cloud product for a period of 60 days. And then from a data protection standpoint, both our Veeam Cloud Connect product that allows for essentially the native capability of Veeam to target and back up to the cloud, allows a Rogers data center to be targeted. We're providing that at an offer of 50% off as well. And Zerto, which is our cloud-based Zerto disaster recovery capability that again harnesses the power of our data centers, of our cloud, and of the Zerto technology to really enable an automated disaster recovery capability that allows applications to be to fail over and recover in a matter of seconds or minutes is also at 50% off. And we're holding those offers off, holding them over until the end of the year, because we just, these have been so critical for Canadian businesses through the pandemic. And so with that, I'd like to thank Craig for your leadership and guidance on the BCP journey. We've got a few minutes left at the end of today's session for Q&A, and I'm going to ask our moderator, Samiti, to help orchestrate the questions.
Thank you, James and Craig. That was a great session. Thanks for sharing all these insights. We have a few questions here. The first question is, what are some of the steps that organizations are taking to mitigate the risks to IT workers?
Sure. I mean, I think what I can share is, I mean, particularly through the pandemic, some of the thinking that Rogers implemented in our data center business. And it really was back to, sort of looking beyond traditional site and infrastructure failure and really looking through the lens of health and safety and protecting our staff. Because we know in any business process, it really boils down to people. We're dependent on people to execute and serve customer needs. And so some of the things now are quite commonplace, and I think we've all learned to adapt with, and that really is things like the daily health checks and surveys for our essential staff. It was essentially ensuring that we had the right PPE in place inside our data centers to allow those staff to operate and protect themselves in that environment. But there were a couple of novel things that we did implement that I think are worth sharing. And I think the first one, and this applies broadly to Canadian enterprises, and particularly from an IT perspective, was the concept of split staffing. And so this was for staff that were designated mission critical that actually had to be on site. That staff really is sort of kept in a perpetual air gap, meaning if one staff member was to become sick or was to be quarantined, that there was no way for us to draw a line between that staff and another group or another staff member. And of course, what that allowed us to do very effectively and to prepare for was if there was any kind of outbreak or site incident, we could effectively quarantine a key set of staff, send them home and ensure that they were safely isolated, and then have that split staff essentially backfill into that critical facility, into that data center. And so we really had set up the mechanics to ensure that, through any type of health incident, that we were able to maintain critical staff levels in our data centers through that split staffing methodology. And I think we found that sort of methodology and that approach has been very useful for other organizations as they look to obviously mitigate the risks to their staff from a health and safety standpoint, but of course also mitigate those people risks and staff risks to some of those essential on-site IT services. Craig, is there anything you'd like to add just in terms of how Canadians are protecting their workloads?
Well, yeah, I think you really summarized all of the best practices that I could think of. The only thing I would just add is organizations need to start thinking about, it's not just an assumption or a thought, it's they need to run the business with a reduced staff. Just you have to plan for unavailability. People are going to be worried about their families. They're not going to show up for work sometimes. They may not have a choice. And if schools close and people go back home, that's going to be more pressure on a lot of families. So it's really important right now that people think about that and take the opportunity to, shall I say, break a few eggs, like try something different, try something that's novel as it relates to the processes, because now is a great time to do that.
Thank you, Craig. We have another question. How do I determine the best data hosting model for my business between on-prem, co-location, and cloud? Is one more resilient than the other?
I think it's a great question. And, with the acceleration and adoption of cloud, the question's not becoming simpler to answer. And so simply put, there are more and more technology choices that are available to customers when it comes to really optimizing their IT environments. And I look at it as a glass kind of half full, right, or full. That with the myriad of options that are available, organizations today really have the opportunity to optimize for their IT outcomes, meaning that there is really no need to compromise when it comes to a solution. And so, we're able to pick the right technology, whether it is on-prem, whether it is co-location, whether it's cloud, and achieve, the right level of RPOs, RTOs, achieve, the right level of flexibility and elasticity, achieve the right level of control and ownership of the technology. And so what really becomes the challenge is particularly where many organizations today are facing critical skill shortages. Fulfilling IT roles was a challenge prior to COVID. And of course, now we've got additional headwinds in terms of, just our ability to execute skills wise. What we really recommend is that, organizations work with service providers that are familiar with and offer multiple technology choices, right? And so, I will hold Rogers out as an example, because our approach and our methodology and our belief is that one cloud can't possibly solve for every set of outcomes. That in order to deliver the best outcome to our customers, that there will be a breadth of technology and data protection solutions that are needed in order to truly sort of meet the needs of every application and every stakeholder in that business. And so what we are increasingly seeing, and I think the industry is very much embraced, is it is a multi-cloud world. And organizations that are being successful in their digital transformation are really able to securely integrate across all of these different technology stacks, whether it's their legacy sort of on-prem environments, whether it's co-located in infrastructure, whether it's hosted, or whether it's public cloud. All of those stacks have to essentially coexist and interoperate with each other in a way that is as sort of frictionless and as simple as possible. And so that really requires an operator that does have experience across all of these different domains.
The one thing I might add is, of those three scenarios, pick two. It's not a question of picking one of the three. You really do need to have data in at least two physically separate configurations, in my opinion.
Okay, thanks, James and Craig. We have 3 more minutes and I have 2 more questions, so I'm just going to combine them. Does the cloud protect my workloads from data loss and failure? And are there any data sovereignty risks associated with storing data in the cloud?
I think those are 2 great questions. And I think we briefly addressed it, Craig, that there is a misconception around cloud and the notion that data is protected in the cloud. And so we spoke a little bit about the shared responsibility model, where every cloud sort of service provider will essentially point to the tenant or the customer and say that the data is your responsibility. There was a widely sort of circulated IT article a few weeks ago where one of the top 5 sort of accounting and compliance firms was reportedly had lost the essentially Teams or Microsoft Teams data and Microsoft Teams chat data for about 100,000 or so employees. And this wasn't the result of anything malicious. This was a routine sort of policy change that an IT staff member made to the IT system that essentially deleted all that information. And there was a false assumption, if you will, that data could be recovered. And of course, that was not correct. That data has been lost, and that data is irrecoverable based on the data protection strategy that firm had designed. And so I think when we look at the technology platforms and options that we presented today, Rogers has the capability to secure and back up Office 365 and Teams data, in the cloud, sort of adjacent to Microsoft, and Craig, to your point, two different places. And so that would have been essentially the recipe to mitigate and protect from that type of data loss. I'll just add one more thing, because it really ties into compliance, right? That many organizations are mandated to protect and retain data for some number of years, right? And when we think of financials, it was typically 7 years. We're hearing now about lifetime retention, where essentially it's 7 years beyond the death or passing of a corporation or of an individual. And so that effectively is forever, because we don't know the longevity of many of these things. And compliance does extend as well to data residency and data sovereignty. Our industry and in the public sector verticals, governments mandate that data, whether it's the production system or the backup copies of data, remains in Canada, remains sovereign within Canada. And so, this is something that businesses consider when it comes to the cloud, really understanding not just where their data is, because where data is doesn't determine the jurisdiction under which the governance of that data falls. It really falls or depends on who is hosting the data. And if the data is hosted by a foreign or a US entity, generally speaking, the expectation is that the jurisdiction of that data is the home of where that cloud provider is resident, or where they live. So, an important consideration for many regulated industries. Craig, anything you want to add to those 2 points?
Yeah, I think you nailed the first one completely. On the sovereignty side, I would just close in saying that privacy is a function of the government in the country in which you live, and Canada is a leading country when it comes to privacy. I think everywhere I go in the world, Canada is synonymous with trust. So I see no reason to sacrifice that alignment by using a provider that isn't actually Canadian. I'll leave it at that.
That's great. Thank you, Craig.
Thanks, James and Craig. I think those were all the questions. Over to you, James.
So I'd like to, first thank Craig for participating today. I think the insights and the advice that you've given were invaluable. The audience certainly appreciates that as well. I would like to remind everyone that today's session really falls into a series of events that Rogers is hosting, particularly and focused on data protection, whether it's backup, disaster recovery, or malware. And for more information, you can go to rogers.com/DC events to see essentially the upcoming set of events and our guest speakers that are participating. So we look forward to seeing you at subsequent sessions. So with that, I'd like to wrap up, and we will see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you too. Bye-bye.